So in the last lesson, we stopped at the fourth pillar mentioned in the book, although the author he did leave out a particular pillar. Perhaps that's due to the copy of the book, or perhaps it was actually missed out by the author. But we're going to come to that inshallah towards the end. And the pillar that we're on now, he says, وَالْإِيمَانُ بِالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ هُوَ التَّصْدِيقُ بِيَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ وَمَا حَوَاهُ مِنَ الْبَعْثِ وَالْحَشْرِ وَالْحِسَابِ وَالْمِيزَانِ وَالصِّرَاطِ وَالْجَنَّةِ وَالنَّارِ وما أعده الله للمتقين من النعيم الذي لا ينفد جعلنا الله منهم وما توعد به للمخالفين من العذاب الأليم المؤبد. So he talks about belief in the final day, the day of judgment, the day of resurrection, and he says it is to have conviction in the fact that it is going to take place, number one, and everything which relates to it, such as resurrection, the assembly of all of creation, the reckoning, being taken into account, our actions, our deeds, the mizan, so the scale, and everything which pertains to that. The details of these things have been mentioned in various ahadith. How do we interpret those things? How do we interpret those things? How do we understand those things? That, of course, depends upon the methods of interpretation when it comes to the issues of aqaid, of aqidah, theology. And you have the main difference being between the Asha'ira or the Maturidiyya and the Hanabila. Do we take these things at face value, or do we take them to be symbolic, metaphorical, etc.? There are various approaches, and that's irrelevant to us. The main point is to believe in these things, to believe that they are going to be in existence, and so on and so forth. And then he says, وَالصِّرَاطِ وَالْجَنَّةِ وَالنَّارِ, and the sirat, so as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, as thin as a piece of hair and as sharp as a sword, and paradise, nar, hellfire, and everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prepared for the muttaqeen, i.e. in paradise, from blessings and gifts and pleasures that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestows upon His righteous servants. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us from them. And that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has threatened the non-believers with, that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned of punishment for those that do not follow the path of His messengers, the path of piety and righteousness, as outlined by the last and final messenger, Muhammad ibn Abdullah alayhi salatu salam. Then he says, وَالْإِيمَانُ بِالْقَدَرِ, and the fifth pillar that he mentions, iman in the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the preordination, the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, هو التصديق بأن ما كان وما يكون هو بتقدير الله تعالى. So to believe that everything which was and everything which will be and everything which is by the preordination, the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. خيرا كان أو شرا, whether it is good or perceived to be evil, wicked. نفعا كان أو ضرا, beneficial or harmful. All of it only happens with the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the preordination of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the evil comes from our misguidance, our lack of following that which has been given to us by the Prophet ﷺ. The good, it can come in what we perceive to be good, and it can come in what we perceive to be bad. We can perceive something to be bad, but actually it's good for us, but we don't recognize it. And perhaps after it's taken place, we do recognize that that thing which we did not like at the time was actually better for us, etc. So you mentioned that the author, rahimahullah, he missed out one of the pillars of Iman, or perhaps it was lost in the transcripts of this book, or something of the sort. But whatever the case, the pillar that was missed out, al-imanu bil-malaika, so to have conviction and belief in the presence and the existence of angels. And of course we have various ahadith which tell us their types and their duties, and some which indicate their forms, etc. And this can all be summarized, belief in angels, belief in the Day of Judgment, belief in things which relate to that, as being belief in the unseen, belief in al-ghaybiyat, al-imanu bil-ghaybiyat, that which we cannot feel, we cannot touch, we cannot see with our own eyes or perceive in this dunya, and perhaps there are moments in which we do perceive their existence, etc. But according to what we determine to be tangible and non-tangible, these things are not perceivable according to the modern standards. So belief in these things, conviction in the existence of these things is a part of faith. And this is an area which we cannot rationalize. We cannot rationalize the existence of angels, the existence of the jinn, the existence of the afterlife, the existence of paradise and hellfire. These things are outside of our capacity to understand. Perhaps in ways we can perceive these things, but we do not have the capacity to understand that which we have not experienced, either individually or collectively. And due to the fact that we cannot experience these things tangibly, it becomes sometimes difficult for people to perceive the existence of such things. But when we look at modern science is often discovering new things which were previously unimaginable. And if we just take, for example, the existence of Wi-Fi technology, the technology such as Bluetooth, radio waves, and other such non-tangible waves and technologies, these things would be considered perhaps to be magic by past generations. These things would be considered unimaginable by past generations. But due to the advancement in technology, we have been able to detect these things and name these things and determine these things' existence. Likewise, there are things which are in existence. There are areas which we do not have the capacity to understand, and these areas are areas wherein we have to simply submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We cannot rationalize. We do not have the capacity to know anything in relation to what is out there. We know a very small amount. If we compare our existence to the existence of our universe, the various galaxies, we cannot even travel outside of our own environment, i.e. the environment of our planet Earth. We do not understand the oceans yet fully. We have explored hardly anything on our own planet. We are always discovering new species. We are always discovering new scientific concepts, and we're coming up with theories as man, I mean. So we have to realize that there are things that we will not have the ability to understand, and we do not understand, and we should be very careful from basing our belief in things on rational thought and logic. Our rational thought and our logic is limited in its scope, and we have to realize that, and that's a part of the test of faith. To believe in that which is unseen is a part of the test that is this life. And so we believe in these things because they have been conveyed to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His word, and by the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam through his prophetic traditions, etc. So what we need to do is determine Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence, which of course we have determined as believers. We believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence. Then we turn to the revelation provided for us by Allah, by the Creator. Once we have turned to that revelation, we take from the revelation, we believe in the revelation as we know that it has come from the Creator of our very existence, the Creator of all things, and the Creator knows better than we know. And so we should not look to rationalize and understand things logically in all areas. There are areas which we will not have the ability to understand. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence, one of those things. The existence of angels, the existence of jinn, the existence of the afterlife, eternity. We as beings which have a beginning and an end, we cannot understand eternity. We cannot understand that which is pre-eternal. We are limited to understand things according to the scope of time that is existent in our reality that we are currently existing within. When we pass away, it may be very, very, very different. We do not have the ability to understand. An example is the child in the mother's womb. If we were to try to communicate with this child, if we imagine that we had the ability to communicate with a child in a mother's womb, and we try to describe to the child that which is the reality of our existence outside of this child's mother's womb, the child in a mother's womb will not have the ability to understand, comprehend. They will not have the ability to even know what we're talking about. Words depend upon meanings. If there is no meaning, the word is meaningless. And so when we, for example, try to describe a river to a child, the child cannot conceptualize the meaning of the word, therefore the word will become useless to the child. So likewise, the next life, we cannot understand these things because we cannot conceptualize the meaning, because the meaning of these things is not something which we have experienced. So we have to realize this fact and submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, submit to belief in everything that Allah has informed us of, even if we do not have the ability to understand it yet. So it's an important point, especially in this time today, wherein we have the tendency to try to rationalize everything, try to understand everything logically. We have been conditioned by our experience and our error. And our error is an error which depends upon the scientific method. But not everything can be understood by science. If we look at emotions, for example, and we look at our ability to feel a link with each other, and so on and so forth. There are so many areas that science cannot explain. The soul, where is the soul? What function or why can the body not function without the soul, and so on and so forth. There are so many areas, and so we have to realize the limited scope and limited ability of modern scientific methods, and depend upon that which is unlimited, that which there is no limit for in regards to knowledge and understanding, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is not limited in His knowledge. There is nothing in existence except that Allah knows about it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Alim. He is the one who knows everything. His knowledge has no boundaries. Our knowledge is extremely limited. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when talking about those who do not believe in Allah and the afterlife and so on and so forth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says they have limited dunya about about the zahir of this dunya. They have a limited amount of knowledge about that which is apparent from this life. But the reality of this life they know nothing about. The purpose of this life, and so on and so forth. Then the author, rahimahullah, he goes on to discuss al-Islam. He says, وَأَمَّا الْإِسْلَامُ فَهُوَ التَّسْلِيمُ لِمَا جَاءَ بِهِ النَّبِيُّ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ عَنْ رَبِّهِ وَهُوَ كَمَا فِي الْحَدِيثِ. So he goes on to mention a hadith. He says, Islam is to submit to that which the Prophet ﷺ has come with from his Lord, i.e. the deen of Islam, that which we would refer to loosely as the religion of Islam, the structure that the Prophet ﷺ came with, which is referred to as al-Islam, submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through carrying out that which the Prophet ﷺ came with. And this is the distinction between Iman and Islam. Iman relates to that which is in relation to the heart, i.e. conviction and belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His angels, His books, the qadr, and so on and so forth. And Islam relates to the actions, that which is practically applicable from the arkan, and so on and so forth. And then he mentions the hadith, shahadati an la ilaha illallah wa anna muhammadan rasulullah wa iqam as-salati wa ita'i az-zakati wa sawmi ramadan wa hajj al-bayti in istata'a ilayhi sabila. So he mentions the famous hadith, the first pillar of Islam being the shahada, then the salah, then zakah, then Ramadan, and then hajj. And then he says, now he's going to give a very, very brief explanation of the shahadatain. At-taslimu li-shahadatain huwa al-ityanu bihima. So how is it that a person can submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through that which the Prophet brought with him? In relation to the shahadatain is simply to pronounce the shahadatain. The pronunciation of the shahadatain, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh, that is submission to Allah through the shahadatain. Then he says, وَالْأَرْبَعَةُ الْبَاقِيَةُ نَذْكُرُهَا فِي أَرْبَعَةِ أَبْوَابٍ لِأَجْلِ الْإِيضَاحِ مِنْ غَيْرِ إِطْنَابٍ. So now he says the other four pillars, we are going to mention them in detail, but it will be concise. It will not be, we will not overdwell on things, and it will not be too complicated. It will be relevant to the person who is starting his path towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we have mentioned, we've discussed over the various lessons so far, that when trying to attain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure, there are three areas that need to be focused upon. Iman, i.e. the aqa'id, the theology of Islam, the ahkam, i.e. Islam, so that which relates to the practical implementation of Islam, and ihsan, the purification of the soul and the heart, the adoption of the quality traits of the Prophet ﷺ, noble and meritorious qualities of character and heart. And these are the areas which we should focus upon. So this book would be in relation to the ahkam, Islam. Now we're going to go into the first chapter, and he's going to go into Iqam al-Salah, the second pillar of Islam. He's going to give an outlay of the preconditions of the Salah and the Arkan, the integrals, etc., so that you can understand, have an overview of the forest before you have a look at the individual trees. But prior to that, just some points to reflect upon. Why, when we're studying, because we're going to be looking at fiqh according to a madhab, the Hanafi madhab, and we discussed this in the first lesson, but just to further mention a few points. We're not going to be mentioning the evidences except for particular issues. Why? Because the beginner is not ready for the evidences, and in order to understand an evidence, you need to have acquired the tools for understanding the evidence. Knowing an evidence is not understanding the evidence. Any person can cite a verse of the Quran or a prophetic tradition, a hadith, but to know how that relates to the ruling, it requires scholarship. It requires a level of understanding. It requires the tools. Books like Al-Waraqat, Nukhbatul Fikr, Al-Muqaddama fi Usul al-Tafsir. These types of books, they are not books which allow a person to understand evidences. These books are introductory texts to allow you to understand what the science that they relate to is about. Al-Waraqat, for example, can be seen as an index which allows you to understand the topics covered in Usul al-Fiqh. Nukhbatul Fikr, likewise, it's like an outline of what is covered in Mustalah al-Hadith. Al-Muqaddama is like an outline of what is covered in Usul al-Tafsir, and so on and so forth. A person should not be fooled into thinking that if they've studied one of these small texts, they are now able to go to the books of Ahadith, etc. No. The science of Hadith, for example, is a science which requires a lifetime of dedication. The science of Fiqh, it requires a lifetime of dedication. The science of Usul, it requires a lifetime of dedication. Language alone, the language, most of these differences of opinion are based upon language. How can a person who does not know the Arabic language understand the differences between evidences? A person cannot cite a hadith in English and say that this is the evidence for this ruling. No. If we are taking from a scholar, it's better we say, this scholar has said that this is an evidence for so on and so forth. Which brings us to the next point. If we are to follow a scholar, it is better to follow a scholar of the past who the Ummah have agreed upon about their righteousness, their uprightness, their morality, their integrity, and their scholarship. And these are the four Imams, without a shadow of a doubt. Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam al-Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad. The Ummah have agreed upon their righteousness, their uprightness, their scholarship, their integrity. And they are individuals who collected the understanding of the companions. When we study fiqh, it's not simply authentic hadith versus weak hadith. This hadith is authentic, let's follow it. This hadith is not authentic, let's not follow it. That's not the way of fiqh. The fuqaha did not use weak hadith sparingly. The fuqaha, many of the ahkam are based upon weak hadith. Of course, there are conditions. You even have the mursal hadith, which a hadith, the chain has not been mentioned, is an evidence in the Hanafi madhab with some conditions, and they have very strong reason for this. The point, we're not going into that as that relates to the science of hadith. The point being that we have to broaden our scope slightly and not be narrow-minded when we study. Studying according to a madhab, you are studying not only the opinions of an imam, you are studying the fatawa, the understanding of the Sahaba, the Tabi'een that came before the Imam, refined by the scholarship that came after the Imam. So, for example, 1,200 years or so of scholarship, that's what you're studying. You're not studying simply the opinions of one individual. No, you are studying the understanding of the companions, the Tabi'een, refined, collected, formulated, and presented in a way which is most suitable to be practiced. That's what we're studying. And if we just look at some of the ulama, some of the imams that we are aware of, they were scholars of Islam, but they were followers of the four imams. For example, in the Hanafi madhab, an imam that everyone is aware of because of his famous text in Islamic theology, Al-Tahawi, the Al-Aqidah Al-Tahawiyya. Imam Al-Tahawi was in fact a Hanafi, and he mentions this in the beginning of his text in theology. He authored many books in the Hanafi madhab, and he is very well known for being an Imam in the Hanafi madhab. His uncle was a Shafi'i, al-Muzani, and you have in the Hanbali madhab the famous scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, Ibn Qudama. They were Hanabila. Ibn Taymiyyah, although people mention his opinions and they like to follow his opinions, he was a Hanbali, and some scholars in the Hanbali madhab would even argue that he was saying this is the correct opinion when he gave his opinion according to the principles of Imam Ahmad. And you'll find in the Hanbali text of Fiqh that his opinion is sometimes mentioned as a wajh, i.e. it's a valid opinion to be considered, although it's not taken as an official opinion in the Hanbali madhab. Likewise, for example, in the Shafi'i madhab, there are many great scholars in the Shafi'i madhab who were followers of Imam al-Shafi'i. Imams for us, Imam al-Nawawi, Imam al-Ghazali, Imam al-Suyuti, al-Sakhawi, and Ibn Hajar, and so on and so forth. Rahimahumullah ta'ala jami'an. All of these individuals were followers of Imam al-Shafi'i, even though perhaps they developed to such an extent that they started to follow the opinions that they believed to be more correct according to their ability to investigate and research. That was at a very late stage. It was at the later stage of their development. And of course, we're not talking about age here. We're talking about development in scholarship. You can have a 40-year-old who is equivalent to a 10-year-old in understanding, and you can have a 10-year-old who perhaps is equivalent to a 40-year-old. Perhaps not in our time today, but the scholars of the past, many of them, they started to give fatwa at a very young age, in their early or late teens, for example. In the Maliki madhab, you have the likes of al-Qurtubi, rahimahullah, Ibn Rushd, and so on and so forth. So we have to realize that the Imams of the past who we follow, they started off by following the Imams who the Ummah have agreed upon. And Imam al-Ghazali, he gives us a very, very wise principle. When you look to a person who you admire, do not try to start where they have finished or where they currently are. Start the way they started so you can reach what they reached. And the example that has been mentioned before, if you go to the gym, for example, and you are not skilled in weightlifting or training, and you try to do what a pro is doing, you'll end up breaking your back and you'll never return to the gym again. Likewise, in scholarship. And we have to be cautious, we have to be humble, we have to realize our level, and our goal here is not a scholarly goal, it's not an academic goal. Our goal here is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in order to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we should follow the opinions of those who know. And if we were to say we want to follow modern contemporary scholars, that's a valid approach to take. But again, who is better to follow? Someone closer to the time of the Salaf? In fact, Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, it is argued by many, is to be considered from the Salaf. He's considered from the Tabi'een, as he saw some of the Sahaba in his lifetime, although he was young in age. But is it better to follow someone who has lived 1,400 years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, or someone who lived in the first few generations of Islam, someone who lived amongst the pious, lived amongst the great scholars of our ummah, lived amongst the companions? Of course, the latter is better, and this is who we are following, these Imams. They are individuals who collected the knowledge of that few or those few generations, and it has been preserved for us and formulated and documented and presented to us. So with that, inshallah, we'll start with the first chapter and we'll take a brief outlook, and then we'll, with the next lesson, take a more in-depth look at the chapter of Tahara. So he says, الباب الأول في إقام الصلاة وهو الإتيان بها مقومة بشروطها وأركانها. So he starts off with a brief introduction to Salah and what the Salah is, i.e. how to establish it. He says it is to perform it, to establish it alongside its conditions, i.e. that which comes prior to the act, and its arkan, its pillars or integrals. So he's giving us now two areas that we need to understand. Number one, you have shara'it, shurut. You have that which is to be considered a condition for the establishment of the prayer, or a prerequisite or a precondition to the act, and that which is an arkan, a pillar or an integral. So what's the difference between a condition and an integral or a pillar? The condition is to be performed prior to the act itself, and an integral is a part of the act. So, for example, a pillar is an integral to the house, but prior to building the house, you have to level the ground. That's a condition for building a stable home. You have to level the ground. So, in the salah, you have the shara'it are 6. The shurut, the conditions are 6. He says, فَشَرَائِطُهَا سِتَّةٌ وَهِيَ الطَّهَارَةُ مِنَ الْحَدَثِ وَالطَّهَارَةُ مِنَ الْخَبَثِ وَسَتْرُ الْعَوْرَةِ وَاسْتِقْبَالُ الْقِبْلَةِ وَالْوَقْتُ وَالنِّيَّةِ. So he says the first condition is الطَّهَارَةُ مِنَ الْحَدَثِ. So basically purification from non-tangible impurities, or you could perhaps say ritual impurities, and we will go into the detail of these things later inshallah. The second, at-taharatu min al-khabath, so purification from literal tangible filth, and what would be determined as filth, we will come to that inshallah when we look at each section in more detail. Number 3, وَسَتْرُ الْعَوْرَةِ, so covering one's awrah, one's nakedness. What is determined as nakedness? Again, we have to make sure it's according to the standards of Islam. A person cannot say, I consider this to be nakedness and I'm going to pray like this. No, it's according to that which has been deemed as nakedness by Allah and His Messenger, as understood by the companions, as collected by the Imams and formulated by their students. وَاسْتِقْبَالُ الْقِبْلَةِ, and facing the qibla, the direction of prayer. وَالْوَقْتِ, the time, to make sure that when we pray, we're praying in the correct time. A person cannot pray prior to the time, nor can they pray after the time. And again, we'll go into some detail in that for it to be, accepted. وَالنِّيَّةِ, and the intention. So then he says, وَأَرْكَانُهَا أَيْضًا سِتَّةٌ وَهِيَ, so the integrals or the pillars of the prayer are also 6. Number 1, تكبيرة الإحرام. Number 2, القيام, so standing. Number 3, القراءة, so recitation. Number 4, الركوع, so the bowing. Number 5, السجود, so prostration. And number 6, القعود الأخير قدر التشهد, the final sitting of the prayer, enough so that a person can carry out the tashahhud. How long and how do you define these things? We're going to look at them inshallah as we come to these. So that's a brief outline of the salah. He didn't mention the wajibat, and we will look at those, and he didn't mention the sunan of the salah. Why? Because he wants to give you a brief overlook of the forest, as we mentioned, prior to investigating the individual trees contained within that forest. So now he says, ثُمَّ الطَّهَارَةُ مِنَ الْحَدَثِ عَلَى قِسْمَيْنِ. Now he goes into the chapter of purification, باب الطهارة. Why is it that he starts with tahara? Because tahara is the first condition for salah. In order to pray, you have to be purified. So now he's going to spend some time detailing the chapters of tahara, the particular areas that a person needs to be aware of in order to purify themselves for salah. And then he will continue with the salah inshallah bi'idhnillah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.